Thanks for tuning into this episode of History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, where we explore history's greatest sieges. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them and stay tuned after for some review of our comments section. In the final years of the 20th century, Russia waged a brutal war to reclaim control over a land that had resisted it for centuries. The Soviet Union had collapsed, leaving behind a fractured empire, and in the chaos, the Chechen people seized their moment. They declared independence, knowing full well that Moscow would never accept it. What followed was a battle for territory, a war for identity, and a fight for survival, for the right to exist beyond the grip of an empire that refused to let go. The conflict was fought in the mountains, in the forests, in the ruined streets of a city reduced to rubble. It was a war where outdated Russian tactics met an enemy that understood every inch of the battlefield. A war where armored columns burned, where elite forces were shattered, where soldiers abandoned their orders and commanders lost control of the men they were supposed to lead. The Russian military, once feared across continents, found itself humiliated by a force it had underestimated at every turn. But this was more than a local war. Its consequences reshaped Russian military strategy, internal politics, and the way Moscow would handle insurgencies for decades to come. The failures exposed in this war led to sweeping reforms, the rise of new military doctrines, and the return of a leadership that vowed to never be humiliated again. When Russia came back to finish what it had begun, it did so with a new understanding of warfare, one that would define conflicts far beyond its own borders. The brutality, the propaganda, the use of raw force to crush resistance. Lessons learned here were later applied in ways the world would come to recognize. This war was not just a regional conflict, it was a turning point. It set the stage for everything that followed, from the rise of modern Russian warfare to the strategies used in later invasions. The cost in lives was staggering, and the destruction was total. And by the end, nothing would be the same. Let's now experience the Siege of Grozny.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, Episode 25, The Siege of Grozny, from December 1994 to February 1995. Russian forces, roughly 40,000 soldiers. Chechen Forces, unknown, but like 5,000 to 8,000 guerrilla fighters. Russia's failure to impose enduring control over Chechnya exposed a fundamental erosion of its military strength and the brittle resolve of its leadership. What should have been a swift and decisive campaign instead unraveled into a prolonged disaster, revealing an army plagued by disorganization, low morale, and tactical ineptitude. The war laid bare the widening gulf between Russia's ambitions and its ability to project power, shaking the nation's confidence in its own might and signaling to the world that the Kremlin no longer commanded the unquestioned dominance it once claimed.
Hostility between Russia and the defiant, battle-hardened people of Chechnya stretches back 3 centuries to the early 1700s. This was an age of empires clawing for dominance, and Tsar Peter the Great saw the Caucasus as a gateway to Persia. He seized Chechnya's lands without hesitation, using them as a staging ground for conquest. The Chechens, a people bred for war in the mountains, did not accept subjugation. They rebelled over and over again. Through the 1800s, Chechnya became one of the strongest centers of Islamic resistance in the Caucasus. Their warriors, bound by faith and an iron will, fought the Russians in relentless jihads, determined to break the chains of foreign rule. But their war was not fought alone. Across the region, other mountain peoples rose with them, turning the Caucasus into a nightmare battlefield for the Russian Empire. The Tsars sent armies to crush them. The Chechens sent them back in coffins. Then came the Bolsheviks. As the Russian Empire collapsed, a new war began. From 1917 to 1924, the Chechens fought both the Red Army and the Menshevik White Army, resisting one Russian invader after another. The Soviet Union was built on the corpses of its enemies, but in the Caucasus, it found warriors who would not break. Moscow knew it had to control them. The Soviets carved up the region, splitting the Chechens and the Ingush into separate districts, hoping to divide and rule. In 1934, they reversed course, merging the two into a single republic. But Stalin, always paranoid and ruthless, shattered it again in 1944. He accused the Chechens and English of treachery. These were lies, but that didn't matter. His response was brutal. They were rounded up, thrown into cattle cars, and exiled to the farthest reaches of the Soviet wasteland. A people ripped from their homeland, punished for crimes they never committed. When Stalin died, his crimes couldn't be ignored forever, and in 1957, the Chechens were allowed to return, their honor officially restored. But Moscow's grip was never gentle. For decades, they lived under the shadow of the Kremlin's watchful eye. Then came 1991, the Soviet Union crumbling. And when empires crumble, men with vision seize the moment. Jakhar Dudayev, a Soviet Air Force general, saw what was coming. He returned to his homeland, rose to power, and in 1991 was elected president of Chechnya. That same year, he declared full independence. Moscow was too weak to stop him at first, but the clock was ticking. In December of 1992, the English chose their own path, breaking away from Chechnya. Meanwhile, the Russians were regrouping. And by 94, they were ready to strike. On the 11th of December, the order came down from the Kremlin. 40,000 Russian troops were sent into Chechnya. Officially, they were there to restore order. The truth was much more simple. Moscow would not tolerate losing control of the region's oil refineries, gas pipelines, and the first petroleum institute ever built in Russia. This was about power, economic and political. The Russians believed they could crush Chechen resistance in days. Grozny, the capital, was the primary target. Yeltsin's government, arrogant and out of touch, demanded that all Chechen fighters disarm by the 15th of December. Not a single Chechen complied. Before the deadline even arrived, Moscow launched an assault. On the 26th of November 1994, Russian forces, disguised as volunteers, attempted to seize Grozny. The operation collapsed in spectacular failure. Dudayev remained in power, his forces unbroken. Russian commanders, embarrassed and unwilling to take responsibility, disavowed the attack. But the failure only fueled the Kremlin's resolve. 2 weeks later, Yeltsin ordered the full invasion. On the 11th of December, Russian armored divisions, pro-Russian Chechen militias, and internal security troops stormed into Chechnya. Their plan was simple: overwhelm the enemy, install a puppet government, and pacify the region. Instead, they walked into a slaughterhouse. The Russians expected an easy victory, but what they got was a city turned into a fortress of death. Russian intelligence had failed spectacularly. They underestimated the enemy, miscalculated the terrain, and sent their men straight into the jaws of a brutal urban war. Chechen fighters were everywhere. Small, mobile units ambushed Russian convoys, disabling tanks and armored personnel carriers with hand grenades and rocket launchers. Russian soldiers were cut down in the streets, trapped in kill zones by enemies who knew every alley, every rooftop, every blind spot. At the train station, an entire Russian force was surrounded, only barely rescued by Major General Lev Rokhlin, one of the few commanders who understood the carnage unfolding around him. Humiliated and bleeding, the Russians responded the only way they knew how, with overwhelming firepower. The bombardment of Grozny was among the most intense of the late 20th century. Russian aircraft, artillery, and missiles pounded the city relentlessly. They didn't just target military positions, they flattened entire neighborhoods. Hospitals, schools, and markets were obliterated. Hundreds of thousands fled. Those who couldn't escape died beneath the rubble. Dudayev was always one step ahead. He abandoned the presidential palace before the Russians could destroy it. The Russians took the city, but they didn't win the war. In mid-February, Moscow installed a puppet government, led by Umar Afterkhanov and Salambek Kadzhiev. They declared Dudayev a fugitive and offered a power-sharing deal to the separatists. The offer was worthless. The Chechens knew what awaited them under Russian rule, and they rejected the deal, and they fought on. The toll was catastrophic. Estimates vary, but the numbers paint a grim picture. 100,000 dead, 240,000 wounded, and 500,000 forced from their homes. The war turned Chechnya into a wasteland. Then, after months of bloodshed, Moscow was forced to negotiate. On the 30th of July, 1995, a ceasefire was signed. It called for prisoner exchanges, the withdrawal of Russian troops, and the disarmament of Chechen Forces, but the deal fell apart, and the war dragged on. By 1996, the pro-Russian government in Grozny was in chaos. Chechen Forces, sensing weakness, launched a devastating counteroffensive. On the 6th of August, they retook Grozny. Moscow was humiliated. Yeltsin, in the middle of his presidential inauguration, was forced to watch as his forces were thrown out of the capital. His war had failed. Desperate for a way out, the Kremlin signed a new peace deal later that month. Russian forces withdrew. Chechnya was back in the hands of the separatists. But the scars of war ran deep and vengeance came swiftly. Those accused of collaborating with the Russians were tortured and executed. The Republic descended into further chaos. Dudayev never lived to see the end of the war. In April 1996, he was killed in a Russian airstrike. His successor, Zalim Khan Yandarbiyev, took his place. Yeltsin, who was scrambling for re-election, declared another ceasefire in May 1996, but it was a ploy. Fighting erupted again in June. By August, Russian Defense Minister Alexander Lebed negotiated a final peace. Chechen President Aslan Maskadov and Yeltsin signed a pact promising a peaceful resolution, but it didn't last. The treaty was a hollow promise, a signature scrawled over a graveyard. Moscow called it peace, Chechnya called it a pause. The war had never truly ended, it had merely caught its breath. By 1998, the illusion had shattered. The streets of Grozny, still smoldering from the last war, braced for the next. Widows wept over shallow graves, knowing they would soon dig more. Fighters who had once laid down their arms now retrieved them from hiding places, their hands steady, and their purpose clear. In the Russian ranks, morale had rotted to the bone. Soldiers muttered open contempt for the Kremlin, calling it a brothel of cowards and bureaucrats who had sent them to die for nothing. Commanders watched their men falter, discipline eroded by a war that had broken them as surely as it had broken Chechnya. They had been sent to conquer, instead they had bled, humiliated and outmaneuvered by warriors half their number but twice their will. And in Moscow, the powerful played their games. They spoke of stability, of negotiations, of lessons learned, but the lessons were ignored. The ceasefire had never been a resolution, it had been a retreat, a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. The First Chechen War had ended only on paper. In the mountains, in the cities, in the hearts of men who had lost everything, the war was still alive. It waited in the shadows, seething, sharpening its blades. And when it returned, it would not be a skirmish. The Second War was already coming, and this time, the wrath of Russia would be absolute. In our episode on the Siege of Kinsale in 1602, K-Dog 543 wrote, "Some Irish wrote back in those days that they had to fight the English in Ireland and cross the seas to halfway across the world and fight them here too. Quote, American Revolution War, Days of a Soldier of Irish Roots in the America or Ancient Antica. God bless America and in God we trust, amen. Give me liberty or give me death. Not so greater words ever been spoken of America saga. Cheers." K-Dog, thank you for the comment, a finer summary of Irish persistence, transatlantic grudges, and fine drink I have never seen. Finding the English in Ireland wasn't enough. We had to chase them across the ocean just to make sure they got the message. And as history shows, the message was delivered loudly with muskets and preferably over a glass of whiskey. As for quotes, take your pick. Washington praising the Irish, Charles Thompson helping pen the Declaration, or John Stark's immortal "Live free or die." The Irish left their mark on the Revolution just as they did on every battlefield, where liberty was at stake. God bless America, and may the pints always be full. Sláinte. And on that same episode, that old gamer, the Earl Zero, commented, "What a lie. Half of Washington's army were Scots-Irish, Protestant Presbyterians from Ulster. Learn your history." Well, that old gamer, the Earl a lie, you say? Yes, the Scots-Irish Ulster Presbyterians made up a significant portion of Washington's army, but they were far from alone. Irish Catholics also fought in the ranks, many of them recent immigrants escaping British persecution. Guys like General Richard Montgomery, Colonel John Fitzgerald, and Stephen Moylan were Irish Catholics who played crucial roles in the Revolution. Your mistake might be assuming that Irish and Scots-Irish are mutually exclusive. They are not. Both groups had deep grievances against the British Crown, and both shed blood for American independence. The Continental Army was a patchwork of men from all walks of life, but to dismiss the Irish Catholics, who stood in those lines alongside their Scots-Irish brethren, is bias. And if you doubt their importance, you can take it up with George Washington himself, who reportedly said, quote, "If the Irish are driven out of this country, liberty is gone with them." Hope you enjoyed the episode. See you tomorrow.